I never thought a single sentence could cut so deep. Leave them there. We'll just say it was a mistake. I heard it with my own ears, spoken by my son over the phone. That moment sliced through me like a slow knife, not only for what it meant in the present, but for everything it woke up inside me, the echoes of a past I've kept buried in silence for far too long. Today, as I remember it, my throat burns as if I still carried a stone lodged inside. Before I continue, may I ask you something? Simple. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep sharing stories that weigh on the soul and at the same time, release it. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Eugenia Luce Parker, and I'm 74 years old. My hair, white as frost, and always tied tightly in a bun that not even the wind on the city bus can undo, tells the passage of time better than I can. My hands, strong and thick from years of kneading, still remember the exact feel of bread dough. Nowadays, I use them to bake biscuits and little pies that I sell outside the neighborhood clinic. It was there, between one thermos of coffee and the next, that I decided to speak. I've kept quiet for so long that silence became a heavy stitch in my chest. But now I have Leah, my adoptive granddaughter who just turned 9. She was the one who asked the question that ripped the lid off everything. Grandma, why did we arrive alone at the airport that morning? I didn't have the courage to give her the full answer, but I knew then I could no longer keep hiding the truth under the rug. It's strange, after so many decades, to open the sealed box of memory. I don't do it to seek pity, nor to settle scores with anyone. I do it as if writing a private letter to my grandchildren, a note tucked inside a sugar jar. Simple, close, sincere. Because I know that if I don't tell it myself, silence will go on protecting the monsters. And I've already done that for too long. Looking at me now, many would say I am a calm woman, living a simple routine, smiling as I hand out warm biscuits to nurses and patients crossing the clinic doors. What they don't see is the weight I've carried on my back since I was a girl. Every smile of mine is sown with hidden scars. Every step, with roads I had to cross in fear. That's why I tell my story today. Because life taught me that silence can be a shelter, but it can also be a prison. My words want to come out, even if they tremble, even if they hurt again when remembered. I speak for the girl I once was, and for the woman I became. I speak because in speaking I set myself free, if only a little. And as I arrange the tray of warm pies and the smell of coffee fills the air, I think that maybe this is the most dignified way I have to break the cycle that haunted me since childhood. My voice, fragile but steady, will be my last act of resistance and my gift to Leah, so she may grow up knowing that fear should never be an inheritance. I remember vividly the small wooden house where I grew up, painted a soft shade of green that faded under the sun. It had a cement porch where we would sit and watch the morning fog drift across the hills. The smell of fresh coffee rose from the kitchen and mixed with the smoke of the wood stove, wrapping the whole house in warmth that was more than physical. It was a home filled with sounds that still soothed me in memory. The clucking of hens, the squeak of the screen door, the laughter of my younger siblings playing barefoot in the yard. My father, everyone called him Ray Parker, worked as a construction helper. He was a quiet man, never wasted words, but his hands spoke louder than anything. They built, they fixed, they carried the weight of our days. My mother merrily sewed through the nights for neighbors, the hum of her old Singer machine becoming the lullaby that carried us to sleep. We never had much money, but I never felt poor. We had warmth, care, and laughter strong enough to shatter any sadness. There were 3 of us children, me, the oldest, then my brothers Tony and Lenora. Being the oldest gave me a sense of responsibility, like I had to protect them even in our games. We invented whole worlds in the dusty yard, drew roads with sticks, and chased the chickens until we fell down, laughing. Tony was always running wild. Lenora trailed me like my shadow. We were poor, yes, but rich in that bond only childhood knows how to create. Mornings, began with my mother's soft humming as she lit the stove. She sang barely above a whisper, but it filled the air with tenderness. I'd wake still half dreaming, listening, knowing that sound meant the day was alive. Soon the scent of bread crisping on the stovetop drifted down the hall, pulling us to the kitchen like an invisible bell. Our town was small, with dirt roads and houses painted in mismatched colors. The center square was the heart of it all, where church festivals took place, where people sold homemade sweets in little cardboard boxes, where drums echoed on feast days. For me, that square was the whole world. I didn't need anything beyond the mountains standing guard around us like protective arms. School was a good walk away, and we went every morning with the bread my mother wrapped in a cloth. The path wound through bushes and stones that seemed to hold secrets. Sometimes we gathered wild flowers to give to our teacher, who always smiled as though they were the finest. Roses. For me, school was a temple. The black chalkboards, the smell of chalk dust, the sound of laughter mixed with lessons. It made me believe in a world much bigger than our town. Afternoons at home followed a rhythm. My mother taught us to sew buttons, to sweep corners properly, to respect the table and give thanks for each plate served. There was never extra food, but we never went to bed hungry. A simple pot of beans and rice felt like a banquet when she told us funny stories from her own childhood. We laughed so hard it erased the weight of the day. Music also lived in our home. My father, though rarely talkative, sometimes pulled out an old accordion. His playing was clumsy, but to us it was a grand concert. Tony would dance in circles, Lenora clapped her hands, and I stared with admiration. Those brief moments were so alive that even now they warm my heart. The seasons set our pace. Summers were dry, the earth cracking under our feet, the heat sharp enough to sting our throats. We played under the sun until our skin burned. Winters brought thick fog rolling down from the hills, covering everything in gray. Then we lit little braziers and huddled as my mother spun stories that made us forget the cold. Each season carried its own gift. I loved helping with the chickens. Gathering eggs made me feel important, like I carried treasures. Carefully, I'd bring them to the kitchen, proud of my fragile bounty. In the evenings, we sat on the porch, peeling corn, laughing, as the sky flared with impossible colors. Simplicity was enough to make us happy. Sundays were special. After church, the square filled with the smell of fresh donuts and the ringing of church bells. My mother wore a white scarf on her head, and to me, she looked like the most elegant woman alive. My father walked beside her with quiet dignity, greeting neighbors with a nod. I felt we were whole, solid, unbreakable. Summer nights were my favorite. We'd lie on the porch, staring at the sky. Tony asked if the stars were holes in heaven's roof, and I invented tales of fairies living among the clouds. Lenora would fall asleep on my arm, and I felt like nothing bad could touch us while we were together. Our clothes were simple, often sewn by my mother's hands. She pieced them together from scraps, but I wore them with pride. Each stitch felt like her love. At school, even if my dress was patchwork, I felt like I carried her care on my skin. Water came from the well in the back. It was heavy. Work, pulling the bucket, but we did it together, singing songs we made up along the way. The splash of water and the coolness on our hands made it feel like magic. That shared effort tied us closer. The heat of midday sent us to nap under a giant oak on a neighbor's lot. That tree was our secret fortress, where we invented games and whispered dreams. I leaned against its rough bark and felt embraced by something larger than myself. At night, before sleep, my mother always gathered us to pray. Her calm voice felt like an invisible shield. I closed my eyes, convinced nothing bad could touch us, as long as she asked heaven to watch over us. That certainty wrapped me like a blanket. Neighbors often left little gifts at our door, some bread, a fruit. That quiet kindness held life together. I grew up believing the world was a kind place, where adults cared for children and no one was left alone. Looking back, I see that my childhood was like fragile glass, so bright, so transparent, that the slightest shadow could crack it. At the time I didn't know it, but that glass was already trembling, about to shatter. Yet while it lasted, it taught me that happiness can live in the smallest of things. The first sign that something was breaking came with my mother's cough. At first it was small, just a rough sound in the mornings, nothing we thought much of. But little by little it grew heavier, echoing through the house until even our laughter felt muffled. I remember watching her pause at the sewing machine, pressing her hand against her chest, her breath shallow, as if the air itself was denying her. Our house was still painted green, still filled with morning coffee, but a shadow had begun to stretch across it. Weeks passed and the cough turned into silence. My mother, always moving, always singing, now spent long hours in bed. Her voice, once the song of our mornings, dimmed like a candle at the end of its wick. The town doctor had no answers, only heavy eyes and a shake of his head. I was too young for words like illness and final, but I understood. My mother's life was slipping away like water through our fingers. The day of her funeral, our small town felt even smaller. The scent of wilted flowers mixed with the incense of the church. Neighbors whispered prayers, and the pew beside us was achingly empty. My father, Ray, stood stiff, a statue carved in grief. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at the floor with glassy eyes. I clung to Tony and Lenora, trying to shield them with my arms, though inside I knew nothing could protect us from this emptiness. After she was gone, the house lost its music. The stove lit without her humming. The table was set without her stories. The sewing machine stood silent, like a stopped heart. Even the sunlight felt colder on the wooden floor. I tried to imitate her, making the coffee, tidying rooms, telling jokes to my siblings, but everything I did only underlined her absence. The gap was too large for a child to fill. My father, once steady, began to sink into his own silence. He spent longer at the tavern, his body carrying the smell of drink when he stumbled home. Sometimes he sat on the porch for hours, staring at nothing. He was there, yet he wasn't. His grief had hollowed him out. Our home, once full of warmth, now felt like a shell with no center. That was when Uncle Charles appeared. He was my father's brother, who came saying he wanted to help with the children. He arrived neatly dressed, with polished shoes and a smile that made the neighbors nod approvingly. He fixed fences, brought groceries, asked about schoolwork. To everyone outside, he seemed a blessing, but to me, even at first glance, something about him chilled my skin. My father, too lost in sorrow, accepted his presence without question. "The children need a man in the house," he said, as if he had stepped out of that role himself. Overnight, Charles took a seat at the head of the table, gave orders about bedtime, corrected us with sharp words. At first I thought it was discipline, the kind adults enforced, but his eyes lingered too long. His voice slid between kindness and threat. I felt it before I could explain it. Danger had moved into our house. The neighbors praised him constantly. "You're lucky to have Charles," they told us. "He's a good man." I listened with my lips pressed tight, my head lowered. To them he was a savior. To me, he was a shadow growing larger with every passing day. The distance between their view and my reality made me feel even more alone. Soon, everything about our routines shifted. We were no longer the children who laughed freely in the yard. There were rules, inspections, silences. Tony grew quieter. Lenora clung to me often, and I stayed on edge, alert to every sound, every movement. It was as though the air in the house had grown heavy, pressing down on us. The laughter my mother had left behind was fading. That was how our home transformed, from a refuge of warmth and simplicity into a place where shadows lengthened even in bright sunlight. My mother's death had opened the door, and Charles, with his polished shoes and practiced smile, stepped in to fill it, taking away what was left of our innocence. Charles planted himself into our lives, like roots digging into soil that wasn't his. At first his gestures looked generous. He brought bread from town, repaired loose boards, asked us about school with a smile. But I soon realized those were masks. His eyes moved over us slowly, calculating, like he was measuring how far he could bend our lives to his will. With my father so absent, Charles slid easily into the role no one gave him. He decided when we ate, when we slept, how we spoke. To the neighbors, he was a model uncle, polite, dependable, admired. Inside our house, he became a judge whose verdict was always fear. Passing him in the hallway felt like walking under a storm cloud ready to break. The first blows weren't fists, but words. Ungrateful girl. Sharp tongue. Defiant eyes. His voice cut sharper than any knife. I learned to drop my gaze, to press my lips shut, to pretend obedience. Each word branded me deeper, a mark no one else could see. Soon the words turned into touches disguised as correction. Stand straight, he'd say, shoving my back so hard it ached. Show respect, and his grip on my arm left bruises under my sleeves. It's just play, he'd mutter, after pushing me into a wall. No one saw. To anyone else, it looked like discipline or teasing, but I knew. At night, the hallway became a battlefield. The creak of floorboards was my warning bell. Every step of his felt like a drum in my chest. I trained myself to recognize his gait, to tell if he had been drinking, to decide whether to fake sleep or stay alert. Survival was guessing right. My father noticed nothing. He sat slumped in grief and liquor, blind to what grew around him. Charles filled that void, and while the town admired him as our protector, I saw him for what he was, our captor. I shielded Tony and Lenora as best I could. When they asked about bruises, I turned them into clumsy accidents. I kept them distracted with games, kept them close to me at night. My body became the wall between them and him, though inside, I felt like paper against fire. The cruelty was subtle but relentless. If a dish was dirty, he made me scrub until my fingers bled. If a door was left ajar, he roared until I shrank inside myself. Sometimes he leaned close, whispering words no one else heard, threats wrapped in silk. It was control woven so tightly it left no space for air. I learned to move silently, to breathe shallowly, to never drop a spoon too loudly. Each gesture was calculated to avoid his anger. Childhood had been traded for constant vigilance, like living with a wolf in the dark. The worst was his mask outside. In church, he knelt with saintly devotion. At gatherings, he offered advice with calm authority. Everyone admired him. Watching him play saint while I knew the monster behind the smile was unbearable. My silence felt heavier with every praise he received. Sometimes he pretended kindness, resting a hand on my shoulder saying I should be grateful he stayed to raise us. I nodded, because resistance risked punishment. But inside, his softness was more terrifying than his rage. Nights stretched endlessly. The wind rattled windows while I braced for the sound of floorboards. My heart beat so loud I feared he could hear it. Some nights I was spared, others I wasn't. Each dawn survived was both a victory and another piece of my childhood lost. The fear seeped into my body. Sleep became shallow. My stomach clenched against food. I wore loose clothes, not just to hide marks, but to hide a body I wanted invisible. I was still a child, but inside I felt already stripped of innocence. Tony and Lenora noticed more than I admitted. Their eyes carried questions I couldn't answer. I told them only, stay quiet, obey, don't draw his attention. My silence was both shield and prison. The neighbors praised him endlessly. Lucky you have Charles. A man like that is rare. Their words were knives I swallowed in silence. To them, he was guardian. To me, predator. My only refuge was ritual. I gripped my mother's old rosary under the blanket until the beads dug into my palms. I scribbled in a hidden notebook, birds, doors, keys, symbols of escape. Whispered prayers lulled me into fragile sleep. Leaving the écouting house was a breath of freedom. At school, at the square, even with him nearby, I felt lighter with other eyes watching. But coming home meant stepping back into the tunnel, where shadows stretched longer than daylight. Over time, I grew skilled at reading him. A twitch of his jaw, the sharpness of his gaze, the way he carried his coat, I could predict his moods. My survival depended on studying him as one studies a predator. I was no longer a girl, but a sentry. One eye always open, muscles tensed, mind rehearsing lies to cover bruises. My world narrowed to surviving him and guarding my siblings. Silence became my only weapon, though it also caged me. Sometimes I wondered if life had always been this way. Had I forgotten laughter without fear? Was my mother's warmth only a dream? He was stealing even my memories, darkening them until only his shadow remained. And so the months passed. Charles rooted himself as master of our house, while my father drank deeper into absence. To the world, he was our savior. Inside, he was the reason the crystal of my childhood lay shattered on the floor, each shard cutting deeper into me every day. Silence became my only strategy for staying alive. Not an empty silence, but a dense one, packed tight with fear and secrets. I woke before dawn to light the stove, boil water for coffee, and iron out the creases of the day, as if smoothing a wrinkled sheet. While the kettle hissed, I practiced the expressions I'd wear in public: the small nod, the careful smile, the eyes that gave nothing away. I learned to wipe up fear the way I swept the porch, quickly, neatly, leaving no trace in the corners. No one taught me this. The house itself did, with its floorboards that tattled and its doors that asked questions I didn't dare answer. Tony and Lenora were the anchors I tied myself to. I braided Lenora's hair and tucked in the ribbon twice so it wouldn't slip. I made sure Tony's shirt was clean, even when the basin water grayed with dust. I taught them little songs our mother used to hum, made up games that kept them inside my orbit, close enough for me to shield them if the air shifted. Their laughter, when I could coax it out, was a fragile lantern. I'd hold it up against the dark like a promise I had no right to make. And yet I made it every morning. Nights were the cruelest stretch. The hallway might as well have been a river I had to swim across blindfolded. When the house settled and the wind scratched the screens, I lay, listening for the pattern of steps that meant danger. If Tony or Lenora stirred, I whispered easy explanations. Mice in the walls, a loose shutter, old wood groaning with the cold. The lies came on soft feet. I hated them, but I used them like a quilt to pull over my siblings' small bodies, warming them with a falsehood that kept the frost of truth away for another hour. Exhaustion became a roommate I never invited. Sleep came in thin threads that snapped at the slightest sound. I ate my own nerves all day and chewed my terror at night until my jaw ached. In the mirror, my eyes sank into shadows and my cheeks hollowed out. I learned to splash them with cold water and pinch color into them before school. Weariness settled into my bones, not as a passing guest, but as a permanent tenant who paid no rent and offered no apology. Even then, I kept the chores moving. If the house fell apart, I told myself, my siblings might too. My skin told stories I needed to hide. Long sleeves became my armor even under July sun, and I pretended the heat didn't matter. Skirts longer than my knees concealed what I couldn't explain. When anyone asked, I was ready with accidents. A fall from the porch step, a snag on barbed wire, a clumsy bump into a chair. I learned the art of the half-laugh, the shrug that ends questions. Fabric became language, cotton and denim speaking for me where my voice couldn't. Nothing to see here, keep moving. School was supposed to be safe, but my mind drifted like smoke. Words on the board blurred. Numbers refused to line up. My notebook filled with restless lines. Keys, doors, birds mid-flight sketched into the margins like tiny, stubborn hopes. The teacher called my name and I blinked back into the room, cheeks warm, answers caught behind my teeth. Once or twice, she lingered at my desk, her hand a brief weight on my shoulder, her eyes searching. "You all right, Eugenia?" I nodded, a practiced motion. The truth stayed in its cage. Charles's reputation in town turned the screws tighter. People praised him at the grocery, tipped their hats to him after church, thanked him for favors I knew he kept an invoice for in his mind. He talked about responsibility and sacrifice in a voice that sounded like good wood, solid, dependable. Hearing it made me feel crazed, like I was the only person who could see the rot beneath the varnish. I learned to breathe through those moments, counting to 5 with my tongue pressed to the roof of my mouth, as if that pressure could keep my insides from spilling out. Sundays were a special kind of torment. We knelt in the second pew from the front, while he bowed his head with the devotion of a saint. The hymn book trembled in my hands, and I willed the paper not to rustle. In the church basement afterward, he balanced coffee and conversation with an ease that made neighbors beam. I stood nearby, the good niece, collecting styrofoam cups and smiles I couldn't return. Every "such a blessing to your family" hit like a small stone thrown at a window, only I could hear cracking. My appetite thinned to a thread. Food tasted like it had been left too long in the oven, dry and edged with something burnt. I forced bites past the lump in my throat, mindful of Lenora's watchful eyes. In secret, I welcomed the lightness, the way my body seemed to take up less space. Smaller meant harder to catch sight of. Invisible meant safe or close to it. I knew that wasn't true, not really, but the lie rested easier than hunger. My father drifted through the rooms like smoke after a fire, present but without shape. His grief had swallowed him whole and spit out a man who avoided mirrors, who spent his hours staring through us as if we were ghosts. Sometimes I resented him with a heat that scared me. Sometimes I pitied him so fiercely it hurt. Mostly I learned to step around him the way I stepped around the missing boards on the porch, careful not to fall through, careful not to ask them to hold any weight. Silence didn't only live in my mouth, it moved into my hands. I stopped telling stories the way I used to. Laughter, once a quick guest, stopped knocking. I conserved my words like winter coal. The less I said, the safer I felt. But safety and loneliness travel in the same coat, and soon I couldn't tell which one I had wrapped around my shoulders. My quiet kept danger out, and me in. Some afternoons I slipped to the chicken yard and sat by the fence, watching the hens scratch and settle, their simple world steady as a metronome. The smell of hay and warm feathers grounded me. Out there, the house was an outline behind me, the hallway a rumor instead of a fact. Tears came easier outdoors. The wind did me the kindness of carrying them away before they could glaze my face with salt. I'd return inside with a steadier heartbeat, the mask reseated, the chores waiting like patient sentries. With Tony and Lenora, I chased tenderness like it might run off if I wasn't quick. I read them the same. Book 3 times because Lenora liked how I did the voices, because Tony pretended he didn't care, and then leaned closer anyway. I held them longer than necessary when I tucked them in, counting the beats of their breathing like a spell that could make them sleep through anything. Those moments felt like stolen fruit, sweet, brief, dangerous to keep but impossible not to taste. Oversized clothes became a uniform for survival. I wore my mother's old cardigan even when the cuffs dangled past me. Fingers. The extra fabric felt like walls I could carry with me. I catalogued hiding places the way other kids collected marbles. Behind the curtain in the front room, under the table pushed close to the wall, inside the crawl space where the air was cool and smelled like damp earth. I practiced slipping in and out quietly until it felt like the only art I'd ever mastered. Fear didn't wait for night. It walked around at noon like it paid rent. I learned to scan Charles the moment he stepped through a door. Was his jaw tight? Had he loosened his belt a notch after lunch? Did he hang his coat angrily or smooth the sleeve before the hook? Each detail belonged to a code only I read. My pulse answered to that language, speeding up or flattening out, my body making choices my mind hadn't caught up to yet. My siblings' questions sharpened with time. Why don't you play tag anymore? Why do you always wear sweaters? Why do you jump when the floor creaks? I became fluent in distraction, suggesting homework, inventing errands, turning questions back into games. Their faith in me was as heavy as it was holy. I hefted it daily, terrified I would drop it, more terrified of what would happen if I didn't carry it at all. At night my prayers frayed and then rewove themselves. I still whispered the Our Father because muscle memory did the work my mind couldn't. But I added other words underneath, quiet as moss. Mama, if you can hear me, lend me your backbone. Help me keep them whole. I addressed the ceiling, the dark, the little crack where the plaster spidered near the window. The room didn't answer, but my voice, thin as it was, proved I hadn't disappeared entirely. Sometimes kindness arrived wearing ordinary clothes. A neighbor left 2 apples on our step without knocking. The teacher pressed an extra brownie into my hand at lunch and looked away so I wouldn't have to explain. The cashier at the store counted $1 short and said, "We'll call it even." I stored each small mercy like a match in a dry tin, knowing I might need to strike one later when the dark pressed too close. I divided myself into 2 versions like a magician's trick, outside Eugenia and inside Eugenia. The outside one did chores, recited spelling words, thanked people with a steady voice. The inside one paced the hallway of my ribs, checking windows, listening for steps that didn't belong. Switching between them was exhausting, but it kept me functional. If you'd asked which one was the real me, I wouldn't have known how to answer without breaking. Time changed shape. Days stretched like taffy, sticky and slow, while weeks snapped past so fast I lost count. Each morning I told myself, one less day to endure, one day closer to something else. I didn't know what that something was. The sentence trailed off like a road sign with the arrow missing. Still, saying it kept a pilot light flickering, and sometimes that warmth was all I had. My hands betrayed me in small ways. They trembled when I poured milk or laced Lenora's shoes, when chalk dust drifted onto my fingers and I wrote my name on the board. I hid the shaking by moving deliberately, smoothing tablecloths that didn't need smoothing, folding already folded towels. If someone noticed, I smiled like a photograph, flat, tidy, untouchable, and asked if they wanted more coffee. In my mind, escape took the shape of a map I drew and redrew. Some nights I planned the exact steps, the back door, the fence, the road where the trees leaned in like eavesdroppers. I pictured the cornfield swallowing me whole, the creek carrying my reflection someplace else. But the map always circled back to Tony and Lenora asleep in their beds. I could leave only if I took them. I could take them only if I grew wings. So I stayed, wingless and wide awake. The longer it went on, the more ordinary it became. That's another cruelty people don't talk about. How terror can settle into routine. How your body can normalize the quickened heartbeat, the flinch, the relief that tastes like metal. I told myself getting used to it didn't mean it hurt less. It meant my muscles had learned the choreography. I hated that dance and performed it anyway, because breaking rhythm had consequences. My body turned into a map only I could read. Not the bruises, those faded and returned like unwelcome seasons, but the invisible topography, the tight band across my ribs when footsteps paused outside my door, the hollow under my collarbone that ached when someone praised Charles within earshot, the prickling scalp at the first hint of his cologne. If you'd asked me to point to fear, I could have traced it with a fingertip along my skin, and yet tenderness refused to die. It lived in small rebellions, the way I warmed Tony's socks by the stove on the coldest mornings, the extra spoon of sugar I gave Lenora when she looked particularly small, the daisy chain I threaded for myself and then tucked into the hem of my cardigan. Nothing grand, nothing that would change the weather, but enough to remind me I was still a person making choices, not just an object choices were made about. The silence that had once felt like a shield began, little by little, to feel like iron bars. Every time I bit back words, I heard them clang softly inside, stacking into a cage. Still, I leaned into it, because the alternative, speaking and not being believed, seemed like a deeper, colder cell. I told myself I could endure my own. Quiet, if it kept my siblings' world from cracking one more inch. Some evenings, when the sky turned the color of a bruise, I traced the grain of the table and counted what I knew for certain. The kettle whistles at 7. The bus passes at 8. The mail comes before noon unless it rains. Facts steadied me. They were the fence posts in a field where borders had otherwise gone wobbly. I added to the list whenever I could, pinning the day to the earth with simple nails. I learned to make my mind quiet even when my heart ran like a hunted thing. It was a trick. Slow the breath, soften the jaw, drop the shoulders. Charles liked compliance. He read stillness as surrender. I made mine a disguise. Under the hush, thoughts scouted exits and rehearsed alibis. It sounds clever written down. Living it felt like being both actor and audience in a play you despise and can't leave. When Charles wasn't home, the house exhaled. The walls loosened. I opened windows and let wind push through every room, like a benign stranger. In those hours, I moved differently. Shoulders notched back, steps a touch louder. I'd let a song slip past my teeth. Just a hum, just enough to prove the voice box still worked. Then I'd tidy fast, because relief has a clock on it, and I didn't want to waste any. There were days I almost convinced myself we were fine. Tony laughed at a joke I didn't even finish. Lenora fell asleep with jam on her mouth, and the sun lit dust motes into tiny galaxies. On those days, dread sat further away, on the porch steps maybe, smoking and biding its time. I was grateful for the distance, even knowing it was temporary. Borrowed time still tells sweet stories. The town went on, oblivious and efficient. School bells rang, store signs flipped from closed to open. Church ladies organized potlucks with lists and clipboards. I slipped among those rhythms like a fish adjusting to current. I learned how to look normal in motion, to pass in daylight, to keep my catastrophes compact, enough to tuck into a pocket. Shrinking became a skill I could have meddled in if they gave medals for that sort of thing. On the worst nights, I kept a mental yearbook of safe images. My mother's hands dusted with flour, the porch after rain, the way Tony's hair stuck up in the back no matter how I licked my palm and smoothed it down, Lenora's eyelashes resting on her cheeks like commas that promised the sentence would go on. I recited those images until the panic lessened, until the ceiling returned to being a ceiling instead of a lid. The calendar pages turned. How, I couldn't say. I marked time by small repairs. The day the screen door got patched. The week the good knife went missing and reappeared. The month the garden tried to die and then didn't. Growth and rot took turns. I did too. I learned to tend what would live and to bury what wouldn't, even when both jobs made my hands shake. More than once, I stood in front of the mirror and practiced the face I'd wear if someone asked the right question in the right tone. I tried on truth and found it didn't fit yet. The sleeves were too long, the hem dragged. I folded it carefully and put it back on the shelf for later. Then I buttoned up silence again, the familiar coat whose seams I knew by touch. Through it all, I waited without admitting I was waiting for a slip in his mask, for a witness, for a door to open and stay open long enough for all three of us to step through. Waiting is its own labor. It builds calluses in strange places. Mine formed around hope, thick enough to let me grip it without bleeding. I held on. I kept them close. I kept breathing. And the days, stubborn as they are, kept arriving for me to outlast. The first spark of resistance didn't come from a grand plan. It came from survival. One afternoon, I realized the small window in my room could be latched from the inside if I wedged a bent nail into the frame. That crude invention gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't much, barely a barrier, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I could tell myself I had drawn a line, however thin. Tony and Lenora, I invented a secret code. 3 quick claps, 2 slow ones. If I ever heard that rhythm, I was to come running. They didn't fully understand, but they memorized it, their small hands practicing until the pattern became second nature. It was our private language, a quiet thread that bound us together, reminding me that I wasn't completely powerless. My refuge on paper also became an act of defiance. I hid an old notebook beneath my mattress and filled it with crooked words, drawings, and fragments of memories of my mother. I sketched birds mid-flight, keys without locks, doors opening to blank spaces. Each line was a whispered protest, proof that even if my voice was locked away, my imagination could still slip through the bars. Light arrived one day in the shape of Mrs. O'Donnell, a widow who moved into the house. Across the street, she sewed for the town like my mother once had, and sometimes handed me fabric scraps. One day, while giving me a piece of floral cloth, she said quietly, "If you ever need it, my door sticks, but it opens." She didn't look at me directly, but her words etched themselves into me. Someone saw more than I let on. After that, I started watching Charles differently. I studied the twitch of his jaw, the way his footsteps changed with each drink, the subtle shift of his smile when anger bubbled beneath. My fear turned into a kind of vigilance. I couldn't stop him, but I could predict him, sidestep him, dull his reach. Strategy, even in scraps, was its own kind of rebellion. The fear was still there, but it no longer swallowed me whole. I learned to trick him. Sometimes if I faked deep sleep, he'd move on. Other times I invented errands with Tony or dragged Lenora into games just to keep them out of his sight. Each small success felt like a tiny victory, invisible too. Everyone but me. One night when Charles staggered home drunk, I slipped Lenora under the bed and kept my body planted in plain sight, forcing his attention on me instead. My chest hammered so hard I thought it would split open, but when he finally left the room, my sister crawled out with tears on her cheeks. I held her so tight it hurt. That night I understood. My resistance wasn't for me, it was for them. At school, I started leaving little cracks in the mask. My teacher asked gently if everything was fine. I always said yes, but my drawings told otherwise. She didn't push. Instead, she rested a hand on my shoulder one day and whispered, "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." That offer became a lifeline, a rope coiled and waiting, even if I never tugged it. My body learned to resist too. When Charles leaned too close, I stiffened, turned into stone. It wasn't submission, it was refusal. He read my silence as compliance, but inside I knew it was my way of saying no. My muscles held my protest when my mouth couldn't. Every night, my prayers sharpened. I still whispered the old words, but I added new ones, speaking to my mother in the dark. Help me keep them safe. Help me stay standing. I imagined her listening, nodding. That belief, fragile as it was, kept my knees from buckling. Sometimes I dared to meet his eyes, if only for a heartbeat. It was reckless, I knew, but in that fleeting second I felt like I was telling him, "You won't break me." His scowl deepened. Insults hissed between his teeth, but I clung to those moments of defiance, like matches sparking in the dark. Small acts of rebellion became the bricks of an invisible wall, a locked window, a notebook hidden under the mattress, a secret code of claps, lies crafted to protect my siblings. Alone they were scraps. Together they built something, fragile but mine. Over time I realized that this was how I would endure, not through dramatic escapes or sudden rescues, but through tiny choices that kept me human. The monster hadn't consumed me entirely. I still had corners he couldn't reach, and as long as I had even one corner left, I would defend it. And so, resistance became a whisper, unheard by others, but loud inside me, a steady pulse reminding me that silence wasn't surrender. Not yet. The night it all snapped didn't arrive with thunder or sirens. It came on soft feet, a wind whirring the eaves and the house settling into its creaks. I lay awake, counting the breaths between those sounds, the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder to know how close the storm is. Tony's snore was a small saw cutting the dark. Lenora's breath puffed against my wrist where she'd fallen asleep beside me. Then came the sound I knew by bone, the floorboard at the end of the hall giving up a long sigh. Another step, weight shifting, the hush before a hand tests a door. The nail in my window was set. The chair was wedged under the knob. None of it felt like enough. I tasted pennies. Something in the air had changed shape and would not change back. I slid off the mattress without letting the springs complain and tucked Lenora into the pocket of shadow under the bed. Not a sound, I mouthed, words too dangerous to speak aloud. Tony started to stir, and I wrapped my fingers around his, our code thrumming in my head. 3 quick, 2 slow, though clapping now would be suicide. I could hear Charles's breath before his knuckles met the wood, that slow roll of air that meant liquor and certainty. The chair shuddered under the first push, skittered under the second, and toppled at the third like it had agreed to betray me. The door swung in a few inches, and the dark poured through like smoke. "What are you hiding, girl?" he whispered, his voice broad as a grin you couldn't see. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty. It's a loaded chamber. I felt it press against my ribs as he shouldered the door wider, the wedge of hallway light cutting our room into before and after. I stood between him and Tony, palms open, as if I could hold back a river with skin and will. My mouth tasted like I'd chewed a copper penny flat. He was close enough I could count the pores along his nose, close enough to see the sweet shine of liquor in his eyes. "Move," he said, quiet as a knife sliding from a drawer. And somewhere under all that fear, a thread pulled tight. The words Mrs. O'Donnell had placed in my pocket. "My door sticks, but it opens." Something in me reached for that hinge. He stepped closer, the air bending around his shoulder, and I did the one thing I had promised myself I would never do, because it might make everything worse. I screamed. It wasn't a word. It was the kind of sound that tears a throat and still finds more. It filled the hallway, crashed against walls, shook dust from the ceiling like a small private earthquake. My own ears rang with it, my vision flashed hot and strange. But I didn't stop until my breath clipped and my chest burned. The scream was the flare over a dark field, the alarm I had prayed to never use. In its wake, the quiet came back bigger than before, and with it, footsteps that weren't his. My father staggered into the doorframe, hair wild, eyes confused, the smell of old sorrow around him like a coat. For a heartbeat he looked like a boy lost in a cornfield, turning in circles, unsure where the rustling came from. His gaze moved from me to Tony's small shoulder peeking behind my hip, to the slice of sheet rucked up where Lenora had disappeared to Charles. Too close, too certain. I watched the moment understanding hauled itself up through his grief like a diver coming up from deep water, coughing. Something sharp cleared in his face. He said my name like a question, and then like an answer. "Eugenia." Charles spoke first, smooth as always, lying with the ease of someone who's practiced it in a mirror. "Ray," he said, a half laugh hitching in his throat. "The kids were up, doors unlocked, mischief brewing. I was setting them straight. You know how they are since Merrily." He let my mother's name fall between us like an anchor he believed would hold. He smiled without showing teeth, measured, a man doing a hard job for a family that wasn't his. The words hung there, plausible to anyone who hadn't lived in our hallways. My father's eyes didn't leave mine. I held his gaze like a lifeline. I didn't blink. If I looked away, the truth might too. My father moved in a way I had not seen since before the funeral. Sure, quick, solid. He stepped between us and put both hands on Charles's chest, pushing him back so the hallway light redrew its line. "Out!" he said, not loud, not shaky, just a word that finally remembered it had teeth. Charles laughed, then didn't. The mask cracked at the corner. Something mean flashed through and stayed. "You'll regret this," he hissed. And for the first time, The sound he made fit the shape I'd always seen. My father didn't answer. He pushed again. The second time, Charles stumbled. The third, he caught himself on the door jamb, pulled his coat from the hook with a jerk that left the hook dangling, and walked into the night because the light behind my father said there was nowhere else to go. The house held its breath for several seconds after the door clicked shut, like it was afraid to believe in quiet. Then everything exhaled at once. The walls, the floorboards, my lungs. I slid down the wall, landing on the cool planks hard enough to feel the bruise. Growing a map on my hip, Tony crawled into my lap, all angles and heat. Lenora wriggled out from under the bed and tucked herself into my side like a bird into its nest. We shook as a unit, a small, trembling pile of living proof. My father leaned his forehead against the frame and stayed there a long time, palms flat on either side, like he was keeping the door from changing its mind. No one said sorry, no one said thank you. Words would have broken us. Breath was all we could manage. Morning wears a different face after a night like that. The kitchen smelled like coffee and apology, and my father moved around it quiet, sober, older. He fixed the fallen hook and didn't look me in the eye. When neighbors asked about Charles, he said, "He's gone," bland as weather. The town knitted its brows a little but smoothed them again. People are good at ironing out stories that don't fit their closets. Mrs. O'Donnell held out a brown paper bag with bread ends and jam and said, "Door still. Sticks." Her gaze flicked over my shoulder to the hall behind me. I nodded, almost nothing, and felt a strange new weight of being seen. It steadied and scared me in equal measure. The days after weren't clean. Fear didn't evaporate. It set up camp in new corners. I jumped at car doors, flinched at shadows that had the wrong height. Every creak asked me a question I didn't want to answer. But something crucial had shifted. I had a sound now, a weapon that was only mine. My voice had found the hinge on its way out, and the door it opened couldn't be shut the same way again. The rules of the house had been redrafted in my favor by a single hard syllable, out. That syllable echoed when I brushed my teeth, when I braided Lenora's hair, when I stood at the sink and watched the road. My father didn't become a savior. Grief doesn't reverse like a truck. But he sat with us at dinner, and his hand shook less when he passed the salt. He said my name more often, as if using it might stitch something back in place. We didn't talk about that night. The talking lived in the way he moved the chair back under the knob before bed, in the way he checked the back door twice, in the way he paused at my doorway and then kept walking. It wasn't enough to erase what had been done, but it was something, and in a life measured by scraps, something can be a feast. I knew even then that monsters don't evaporate. They step away and plan a new entrance. I kept waiting for Charles to reappear, with a smile sharpened to a point. The waiting could have eaten me. Instead, I fed something else, a small flame that said, "You stood your ground," once. I rehearsed again and again the particular tightening of my throat that had turned into a siren, the way my father's eyes had cleared. I added these to my pocket inventory of survivals. You learn to collect proof you might someday need to show yourself. If this moment reached into your chest the way it reached into mine that night, do one kind thing for this story. Tap like and share it so others who need courage can find it. I'm saying this softly, the way I whispered to my siblings in the dark. No pressure, only an invitation. Algorithms don't raise children or chase off monsters, but they do carry voices farther than a hallway. If you've ever wished for a sign to speak up, let this paragraph be it. And tell me, in the comments if you can bear it, what gave you the strength to make noise? Sometimes bravery echoes. Sometimes it needs a room to echo in. That night didn't end anything. Beginnings almost never look like fireworks. It started a long unwinding instead. I learned to measure safety not in hours but in inches. The distance between my back and a solid door, between my siblings and a shadow, between who I had been and who I was becoming. I didn't yet know that someday I'd stand in an airport with a child's hand in mine, making a different kind of noise into a police officer's recorder. But the line between those moments is straight as a string. A girl in a small room deciding that staying quiet would cost more than the scream. I followed that string forward, knot by knot, until it could hold. The night Charles left our house, something inside me cracked open. It wasn't freedom, not entirely. The fear still lived under my skin, twitching at every sound. But it was air. For the first time in years, I breathed without feeling hunted. I held Tony and Lenora so tight, I thought our bones would fuse, whispering promises I had no idea how to keep, only knowing I would bleed before I broke them. That night was not a happy ending, but it was a door, and doors matter. The days after felt unsteady, like walking on new legs. My father, though still wrapped in grief, was present in a way he hadn't been. He didn't say much. His words had rust on them. But he sat at the table again, passed food, cleared his throat like he was relearning how to be with us. I watched him with a mix of bitterness and strange relief. He had failed us, but he had also stood between us and the monster once. That thin thread of protection was something I hadn't expected, and I clung to it. Mrs. O'Donnell became more than a neighbor. She didn't press me with questions, didn't make me retell what no child should have to put into words. Instead, she handed me scraps of fabric, jars of jam, and sentences disguised as lifelines. My door sticks, but it opens. Some locks are only stubborn, not unbreakable. In her quiet way, she showed me that adults could see, could care, could believe. She planted in me a seed of trust that someday grew roots. Fear didn't evaporate. It still curled at the edges of the day, waiting in the corners. But I carried something new, the knowledge that my voice could matter. That scream had changed the script. It didn't erase the past, but it rewrote my future, line by trembling line. Silence was no longer my only language. I had another now, a raw and ragged one, but strong enough to shatter a mask. Years passed, and I carried both the scars and the strength into motherhood. I swore my son would never inherit my fear, though I learned that promises alone don't erase history. Still, I tried. And when Leah came into my life, when her small hand sought mine, I understood that the cycle could not stay unspoken. She deserved to know love without shadows, safety without conditions. My story became the tool to carve that space for her. The airport years later was my final test. When my son plotted to leave us behind like baggage, I felt the hallway of my childhood close in. But this time I wasn't a girl. I had a plan, papers, proof, and a voice that no longer shook. I pressed record, I stood firm, and I handed the truth to the officer. It was the same act as that scream years ago, only steadier, shaped by time and pain. This time it ended not with silence, but with justice, taking a first step. That day, I closed a circle that had begun in a dark corridor. I didn't erase the monster, but I named him. I didn't erase the silence, but I broke it. I didn't erase the fear, but I carried it into light. I learned that shame belongs to the ones who harm, never to the ones who endure. That lesson cost me my childhood, but it gave my granddaughter something better, an inheritance of courage. If this story touched something in you, I asked gently, like this video, subscribe, and share it. It's not about numbers. It's about carrying voices farther than fear can reach. And tell me, if you will, what you felt listening to my story. I want to know. Because when we speak, when we listen, when we refuse to let silence guard the monsters, we build bridges. And I've learned, after a lifetime, that bridges are stronger than walls.